430 miles northeast of Edmonton, in the kind of January that makes thermometers look like they're apologizing, a pipeline construction crew had been sitting on a frozen right-of-way for 11 days. Not stalled, not delayed, sitting, because the ground beneath their feet had done what ground at minus 42 degrees Celsius does when you push a modern hydraulic trencher into it. It laughed at you. The teeth on a $380,000 Vermeer RT 950 had been spinning against permafrost-hardened clay for the better part of a week, making noise and making heat and making nothing else. The project manager had already called Edmonton twice. The equipment rep had driven up once, looked at the ground, and driven back. The crew had burned through 2 sets of replacement cutting teeth at roughly $4,200 per set, and the trench was 31 inches deep when it needed to be 96. And then, on the morning of the 12th day, a woman named Marlene Ducet showed up pulling a lowboy trailer with a 1958 International TD-24 on it. And the crew chief looked at that machine the way a man looks at something he doesn't have a category for. He'd called her, to be precise. Someone at the co-op in Lac La Biche had given him her number. He hadn't known what he was calling. He'd said the words, "I need a machine that can cut frozen ground." And she'd said, "I know what you need." And that was most of the conversation. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without understanding what a TD-24 is and what Marlene Ducet knew about it, the rest of this story is just a machine doing a job. And it was not just a machine doing a job. The International Harvester TD-24 was introduced in 1947 and produced through 1959. It was, at the time, the largest crawler tractor International Harvester had ever built. The production numbers were small, fewer than 3,000 units across the entire production run, because the machines that need a TD-24 are not common machines. It weighed somewhere between 47,000 and 52,000 pounds, depending on configuration, and it was powered by a 6-cylinder diesel engine that produced its peak torque at a low enough RPM that the numbers on paper look almost unimpressive until you understand what low RPM torque means in frozen ground. It means the machine does not fight the resistance. It absorbs it. It converts it. It keeps moving at the same pace whether the ground is pushing back or not, because the engine's power band is so wide and so flat at the bottom that resistance is not an event. It's just a condition. Marlene Ducet's TD-24 was not stock, but I'll get to that. First, I need to tell you who Marlene Ducet was, because without knowing that, the rest of this story is just a machine. She was 53 years old that January. She had grown up on a mixed farm 40 kilometers south of Lac La Biche, the second of 4 children, the only one who had followed her father into the equipment shed without being asked. Her father, Gérard Ducet, had been a land-clearing contractor from the early 1960s through the mid-1980s. The kind of contractor who worked the boreal fringe country where the oil patch and the bush met, where the ground was either muskeg or rock, or the kind of frozen clay that breaks cable if you're not careful. He'd owned 3 TD-24s across his working life, not because he was sentimental about the model, but because he'd learned, through years of working that particular ground, that nothing else did what a TD-24 did in winter conditions. He'd sold the last one in 1988, when the work dried up and the banks got nervous, and he'd spent the rest of his working life telling anyone who would listen that he'd made a mistake. Marlene had been 21 in 1988. She'd been working alongside her father since she was 14. Not as a helper, not as someone handing wrenches, but as a mechanic in the full sense of the word. Gerard Ducet had taught her the way people teach things when they believe the knowledge is worth keeping. Slowly, completely, with no shortcuts and no explanations omitted. By the time she was 18, she could do a full undercarriage inspection on a TD-24 in the dark. By the time she was 20, she could diagnose injection timing by ear. By the time she was 21 and watching her father sell the last one, she understood exactly what was leaving with it. She spent the next 22 years doing equipment work, running a small repair operation out of the farm property, doing field service for contractors who couldn't afford a dealer ticket, maintaining machines that the dealers had declared uneconomical to service. She married a man named Paul, who drove water trucks for the patch and was, by her own description, the most patient person she had ever met. They had 2 daughters. She kept the farm. She kept the equipment shed. She kept her father's service manuals, his handwritten notes in the margins, his measurements, his observations about what the TD-24 did in cold weather that other machines did not. In 2009, Gerard Ducet died of a stroke in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 days before the ground was soft enough to work. He was 78 years old. He had been in the shop the Friday before, checking a hydraulic line on Marlene's excavator, and he had said, as he was leaving, that he wished he still had a TD-24. She had not thought much of it at the time. She thought about it afterward. In the spring of 2011, she found one. It was sitting on a property east of Athabasca, on land that had been farmed and then abandoned, and was in the process of being sold for timber rights. The machine had been there since approximately 1979, which meant it had been sitting in the boreal fringe for 32 years when she found it. The undercarriage was seized. The fuel system was dry and cracked in several places. The tracks had separated in 2 places on the right side. The cab, and the TD-24 had a minimal cab by any standard, had been colonized by something that had built a nest in the operator's seat. The engine had not turned over in 3 decades, and nobody knew whether it ever would again. She bought it for $2,200 and a handshake. The lowboy rental to move it cost her another $800. She got it to the farm in June of 2011, and she did not touch it until September, because she had other work to do and because she wanted to look at it for a while before she started. What she did in that shed over the following 3 winters is the part of this story that I want you to understand, because it is the reason the machine did what it did that January morning in the Northeast. She did not restore it. She wants to be precise about that distinction. Restoration is about returning something to original specification. What she did was closer to what her father had done with his machines. She rebuilt it to do a specific job in specific conditions, using everything she knew about what those conditions required. She worked from her father's manuals, from his margin notes, from her own 20 years of watching what frozen ground does to equipment. She sourced parts from 3 provinces and 2 American states. Some parts she machined herself on a lathe that had been in the shed since 1974. Some parts she fabricated from stock. The work took her, in total, somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 hours, most of it done between October and March when the field work was slow, most of it done alone, with the shop radio on a country station out of Edmonton and a dog named Buddha sleeping against the track frame. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because this is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that frozen right-of-way. The problem with trenching frozen ground is not a horsepower problem. I want you to understand that clearly, because the pipeline crew's equipment rep had explained their Vermeer's stall in horsepower terms. The machine wasn't powerful enough. The ground was too hard. They needed more machine. That explanation was wrong in a specific and important way. The Vermeer RT-95, that had been spinning its teeth on that right-of-way for 11 days produced, depending on configuration, somewhere between 275 and 300 horsepower. It was a modern machine with a modern engine, modern hydraulics, modern cutting-tooth geometry. On paper, it was an extraordinary amount of machine. The problem was not what it produced. The problem was how it produced it, and what frozen ground does with that production. Frozen ground, and I mean properly frozen ground that has been at -30 or colder for 6 weeks or more, ground that has ice in the clay matrix and frost crystals in the soil pore spaces, does not respond to impact the way soft ground does. It responds to sustained shear force. The distinction matters enormously. Impact force, the kind of force a high RPM cutting system delivers in rapid, repeated blows, will shatter surface frost, and it will make noise, and it will generate heat, and all of that heat goes into the ground and does nothing useful, because the ground is a cold sink the size of a continent, and it will absorb whatever heat you put into it without changing. What moves frozen ground is not impact. It is sustained directional shear, a blade or a ripper that stays in contact with the frozen matrix and applies continuous force in a single direction long enough for the ice crystal structure to fail along its own planes of weakness. That is what a ripper on a heavy crawler does. That is specifically what a ripper on a TD-24 does, because the TD-24's engine delivers its torque at a low enough RPM that the ripper can stay in contact with the frozen matrix through the resistance peaks without the engine hunting or the machine bouncing off the load. The machine is heavy enough, nearly 50,000 pounds, that it cannot be pushed back by frost heave. The undercarriage is wide enough that it distributes the machine's weight across enough ground contact that it doesn't sink in, the places where the frost has made the surface deceptively soft. And the engine, particularly the way Marlene had rebuilt and tuned this one, produced its usable torque in a band that started low and stayed wide, which meant that when the ripper hit a resistance peak, a particularly hard section of clay, a frost lens, a buried rock, the engine did not bog and it did not stall. It absorbed the load, held the RPM in the productive range, and kept the ripper moving. Her father's margin notes had a phrase he used repeatedly: "Let the weight do the work, and let the engine keep the weight moving." She had read that phrase so many times that it had become the way she thought about cold weather earthwork. The Vermeer crew had been trying to cut the frozen ground. She was going to let the TD-24 split it. There was one more thing she had done during those 1,800 hours in the shed, and this is the part that the equipment rep, when he eventually came back to look at the finished trench, spent 45 minutes trying to understand. She had rebuilt the ripper assembly. The TD-24 came from the factory with a single-shank rear ripper option. The shank geometry was designed for general subsoil work, adequate for most conditions, not optimized for any specific one. What Marlene had done, working from her father's notes and from her own observations of how frozen clay fails, was to modify the shank geometry and the tip angle to match the specific failure characteristics of boreal frost-hardened clay. Her father had done something similar on one of his machines in the early 1970s, and he'd written about it in a notebook that she still had. The modification was not complicated in concept. It was a change in the angle at which the tip met the frozen matrix, designed to maximize the shear force along the clay's natural failure planes rather than driving perpendicular to them. In practice, the modification required precise fabrication and careful heat treatment of the new tip, because the forces involved in ripping frozen clay at -40 are large enough to destroy a tip that isn't made correctly. She had made 3 tips before she made one she was satisfied with. The other 2 were on a shelf in the shop. She tested the third one in a section of frozen clay on the back of the farm property the previous February, and it had worked the way her father's notes said it should work. She had not told the pipeline crew any of this when they called. There was no point in explaining it before they'd seen it. Some things you show, not tell. The morning she arrived on the right-of-way was -38 degrees Celsius, with a wind out of the northwest that made it feel like -49. The sky was the color of old tin. The Vermeer RT 950 was sitting at the edge of the right-of-way, with its teeth retracted, and the crew was standing around it in the way crews stand around machines that have failed them. Not angry, just tired. The particular tiredness of men who have been fighting something they can't move. The crew chief's name was Bertrand Kowalski, and he was a large, practical man who had been building pipelines in northern Alberta for 26 years, and who had, by his own account, seen most of what the ground up there could do to equipment. He watched Marlene back the lowboy into position, and he watched the TD-24 come off the trailer, a process that takes longer than you'd expect because 50,000 pounds of crawler tractor does not hurry. And he did not say anything dismissive, and he did not laugh. He had been in this country long enough to know that the machines that look old up here are sometimes old because they work, and the machines that look new are sometimes new because they keep breaking. 2 of his crew were less measured. They were younger men, and they had grown up in an era of horsepower ratings and spec sheets, and what they saw when the TD-24 came off that trailer was a machine from 1958 with surface rust on the track frames and a cab that had been rebuilt with materials that were clearly not original. One of them said something to the other that Marlene did not acknowledge and did not need to. She had heard it before. She had been hearing it for 20 years. She walked the right-of-way for 40 minutes before she put the machine to work. She was reading the ground, looking at the frost pattern, looking at where the surface had heaved and where it hadn't, looking at the color of the clay where the Vermeer's teeth had scratched the surface. She was doing what her father had taught her to do, which was to understand what you were about to do before you did it. Because in frozen ground, the first pass sets the conditions for every pass after it, and if you start wrong, you spend the rest of the day correcting. Bertrand Kowalski walked with her for part of it, and then he stopped walking with her because he understood she wasn't looking for company. She was working. At 9:47 in the morning, she started the TD-24. I want you to understand what that sounds like because it matters. A TD-24 starting cold, and -38 degrees Celsius is cold in a way that is not metaphorical, does not sound like a modern diesel starting. It does not turn over quickly and catch with a smooth idle. It turns over with the particular heaviness of a large engine whose oil has thickened in the cold, and it catches in stages, cylinder by cylinder, finding its combustion rhythm the way a person finds their footing on ice. Carefully, with attention. The exhaust at cold start is white and dense, and it hangs in the still air at -38 in a column that rises straight up because there is no wind that low to move it. The idle settles slowly over 2 or 3 minutes from a rough, loping note to something steadier and deeper, a sound that is less like an engine and more like something breathing. The two younger crew members had stopped talking. She let it warm for 14 minutes. She checked the hydraulics twice. She walked around the machine once with her hand on the track frame, feeling for vibration patterns that didn't belong. She had done this with every machine she'd worked on since she was 14 years old, and she did it now the same way, not as a ritual, but as information. The machine told you things through its frame if you knew how to listen. At 10:03, she dropped the ripper and made the first pass. The TD-24 does not launch. That is not the right word for what it does. It moves from stationary to working speed the way a loaded freight train moves, with a kind of inexorable, weight-backed deliberateness that is not slow so much as it is committed. The ripper tip went into the frozen clay at the angle she had designed it for, and for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, there was resistance. The kind of resistance that had stopped the Vermeer's cutting teeth cold. The kind of resistance that had cost the pipeline company $8,400 in replacement teeth and 11 days of standby time. The TD-24 did not stop. It did not slow in any way that was visible. The engine note dropped perhaps 50 revolutions per minute, perhaps, and then held, and the machine kept moving, and the frozen clay began to fail along the shear plane the ripper tip was creating, splitting in the way that frozen clay splits when you find its weakness, rather than trying to overpower its strength. The surface cracked in a line ahead of the ripper, not in the random shattering pattern of impact cutting, but in a directed fracture that followed the ripper's path like a seam being opened. Bertrand Kowalski said quietly, to no one in particular, "There it is." The first pass was 40 meters. She made it in just under 4 minutes. At the end of the pass, she raised the ripper, turned the machine, and a TD-24 turning in frozen ground is its own thing to watch, the tracks working against each other with a sound like distant thunder. And she made the return pass, working the second shank depth, going deeper into the fracture plane the first pass had established. By the time she had made 4 passes, the crew had stopped standing around the Vermeer. They were standing along the edge of the right-of-way, watching the TD-24 work, and they were watching the way people watch something they are trying to understand. The frozen clay was coming up in slabs. Not dust, not chips, but slabs, the way permafrost-hardened clay comes up when the shear force is right and the depth is right and the machine doing the work is heavy enough to stay in the cut. The trench was opening, not quickly, not with drama, with the same steady, committed pace the machine had started with, a pace that did not change whether the ground was harder or softer, whether the frost was deeper or shallower, because the machine's job was not to react to the ground's resistance. Its job was to outlast it. At 11:20, one of the younger crew members, the one who had said the thing Marlene hadn't acknowledged, walked over to where she had stopped to check the ripper tip and asked her how old the machine was. 66 years, she said. He looked at the trench. He looked at the Vermeer sitting idle at the edge of the right-of-way. He did not say anything else, but he stayed where he was and watched her drop the ripper for the next pass. She worked until 3:45 in the afternoon, when the light dropped below useful and the temperature had fallen another 4 degrees. In that time, she had opened a trench section of approximately 340 meters to a depth of 94 inches, 2 inches deeper than spec, in ground that had defeated a modern hydraulic trencher for 11 days. Bertrand Kowalski came to her when she shut the machine down. He was a man who chose his words the way people choose words when they know the words matter, and he stood for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets before he said anything. "How did you know it would do that?" he said. "My father knew," she said. "I just kept his notes." He nodded once. He looked at the trench. He looked at the TD-24 sitting at idle, exhaust rising straight in the cold air, the engine settling into its end-of-day rhythm. "What do you need for the rest of it?" he said. 4 more days, she said, and someone to keep the fuel topped. He sent one of his crew to get the fuel truck. The equipment rep came back 2 days later. He was the same man who had driven up from Edmonton, looked at the ground, and driven back. He walked the trench for a long time, looking at the walls, looking at the depth, looking at the fracture pattern in the clay. He found Marlene at the machine during a break, and he asked her several questions about the ripper geometry, which she answered. He asked her if she'd be willing to consult on a similar project in British Columbia the following winter, and she told him she'd think about it. She finished the trench section on the afternoon of the 4th day, as she'd said. The total length was 1,140 meters. The average depth was 93 inches. The ground had been, for the entire 4 days, between -35 and -41 degrees Celsius. The TD-24 had not missed a shift. The invoice she sent the pipeline company was for her day rate, fuel costs, and transport. The total was $18,400. The pipeline company's standby costs for the 11 days the Vermeer had been sitting, crew wages, equipment rental, accommodation, fuel for equipment not working, were later estimated by Bertrand Kowalski at somewhere between $190,000 and $220,000. He mentioned this to Marlene when he called to say the invoice had been processed. She said she was glad it worked out. The TD-24 is back in the shed now, on the same farm property south of Lac-la-Biche, where Marlene Ducet grew up and where she still lives. Paul retired from the water trucks 2 years ago and is, by her description, better at cooking than she gave him credit for. The 2 daughters are grown. The dog, named Boudin, is gone, replaced by a younger dog who has not yet learned to sleep against the track frame but is working on it. She has been called 3 more times since that January for similar work. Each time, the caller has been given her number by someone at a co-op, or a parts counter, or a contractor who had heard what happened on that right-of-way. Each time, the conversation has been short. She asks what the ground is doing. She asks what they've already tried. She asks what the temperature is running. And then she tells them whether she can help. Her father's notebooks are in a fireproof box in the farmhouse. She has read them so many times that some of the pages are soft at the corners from handling. She added her own notes to the margins years ago. Her observations from the rebuild, from the test passes on the back of the property, from the 4 days on the right-of-way. The notebooks are thicker now than when Gerard Ducet filled them, and the handwriting changes midway through each page from his to hers, and if you didn't know the history, you might not notice where one ended and the other began. That is, I think, exactly the way he would have wanted it. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not live in spec sheets or equipment manuals, or the databases that equipment reps carry on their tablets. It lives in the margin notes of people who worked a specific piece of ground in specific conditions for long enough to understand what the ground was asking for. It lives in the hands of people who learned from those people, who kept their notebooks and their tools and their machines and their way of reading a frost pattern before they put iron to ground. That knowledge does not announce itself. It does not have sponsor logos. It does not show up in a press release or a product brochure. It shows up on a lowboy trailer at -38 degrees Celsius when a pipeline crew has been sitting on a frozen right-of-way for 11 days, and it goes to work, and it finishes what it came to do, and it goes home. The ground doesn't care what something cost. It doesn't care what year something was built, or what the spec sheet says about horsepower, or what the equipment rep drove up from Edmonton to tell you. The ground is just the ground, and it tells you the truth. And on that right-of-way northeast of Edmonton in January, the truth was a 1958 International TD-24 and the woman who knew what it could do. If you know a story like this one, a machine that shouldn't have worked, a person who knew something the professionals didn't, a piece of knowledge that almost got lost and didn't, put it in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I mean that. These stories don't always make it into the history books. They live in co-op conversations and parts counter phone calls and notebooks and fireproof boxes, and the only way they survive is if somebody writes them down, or somebody tells them to someone who will. Every week on this channel, there is another story like Marlene Ducet's, another person who did the quiet work, who kept the knowledge, who showed up when the modern equipment had run out of answers. If that is the kind of story you want to hear, this is the place to hear it. And if this one hit you, if you know someone who spent years learning something the industry forgot, pass it on. Stories like this don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. Marlene's father knew that. She knows it too. Now you do.